everyone, welcome to 2025 Bumps and Thumps. You're right, this is Bumps and Thumps. And no, I'm not the regular host. I haven't taken over the show. Well, yes, I have today. I've taken it over because I have a special surprise for you, something that I think is long overdue. And I am going to have a guest on the show today. And this guy, he has put over so many wrestlers in the past couple of years, so many authors, so many historians, and he's put them over and let themselves put them over, myself included. And I thought it was about time, way overdue, to introduce my guest today, Brian Ferguson. Join us on Bumps and Thumps.
Hello.
How you doing, buddy?
Oh, I'm good. This is a little bit different for me. I'm usually the guy asking the questions, but I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I tell you what, I wanted to do this because I think, as I said in the introduction, it is a long overdue. You've been, for the last couple of years, in a lot of episodes of Bumps and Thumps, you have put others over. You have let them parade out here and talk about their stuff and their careers and their history. And like I said, myself included. But no one has ever got to know Brian Ferguson, the guy that's given us this great pleasure all these years. So here's the deal. I want to talk a little bit, and we've got a special announcement too that I am so proud of that you're going to be sharing with us. But you know, Brian, I want to know, because you're kind of an anomaly. You're not old like me. You know, I'm 102. And you are an old school wrestling fan, which for your age is not as common as I wish it could be. You are interested in the old school wrestling, and you've allowed a lot of people to put themselves over to talk about it. I guess what I want to ask you first is, how did you, Brian, come across seeing your very first wrestling match to start with? And then what sparked your interest to get into the old stuff?
Okay. Well, first, thanks for doing this. I appreciate it, and all your nice comments. And some people may disagree with you out there.
No,
and that's
they
okay.
come from my heart.
I know they do. So, a little background. My grandfather, who passed away when I was very, very young, probably around 3 years old, he, from what I was told by my mom and my grandmother, would watch All-Star Wrestling every Sunday. That's AWA Verne Gagne. It would come on WTCN Channel 11. And what he would do is on Sunday mornings, he would put me on his lap, and then I would, as a baby, not realizing it, I would watch it with him. I guess I was quiet. That's one way to keep me quiet. So we did that, and then as I got older, I was probably about 5 or 6. I just started watching it, and then my mom remarried a man that they weren't into it at all. So I would end up going to my grandma's house. My grandfather passed away by then, and I'd watch it every Sunday. And I tell you, George, it was such a treat. I mean, that's how I got it. This was in the mid 70s. I was born in 70, so I'm 54 years old. So a little older than, the 40-year-olds and stuff. But I can just remember watching it, always wanting to go to an event. And finally, the AWA used to come to my hometown every year around my birthday, around in early November. So St. Joseph Catholic School, I'm not Catholic, but they had the gymnasium. That's the AWA would hold an event there every year to raise money and help raise funds for the school. So my first one, I was probably about 8 years old. Me and my best friend, Jason DeRusso, would get a ticket, and we would go. Fortunately, my stepdad worked like a swing shift, 3 to 11.
Okay.
So he couldn't bicker and moan about me going to see this. He says, oh, it's fake, it's garbage, blah, blah, blah. It was an outlet for me. and I really enjoyed it. I can remember seeing Greg Gagne, Jumping Jim Brunzell. I believe even Nick Bockwinkel was there one year. Rick Martel, just guys. They'd have one or two, of the superstars of that era, of that time, come in. The rest were, up and comers or jobbers. Enhanced talent is the proper name. But it was good, for that. They'd have 5 or 6 matches. They would all come out they'd have like a 15, 20-minute intermission. They'd all come out, sit at a table, do their signings. And back then, they didn't charge you.
Right.
If you had a program,
yeah.
If you had a program that you bought for like $1 back then, $2, if you had your program, you would say, "Would you mind signing this for me?" They would sign it, no problem. Not charging you $20 for an autograph or $20 for a picture.
Yeah.
You're lucky to get a picture back then. You didn't have cell phones. You just had you had your camera.
Sure.
You had to go develop the film. But, but as I got older, we started to see more expansion of not just the AWA, like probably 83, 84. I started getting Georgia, WCW, World Championship Wrestling. Started getting that on Saturday nights. Mid-South, then turned into UWF, Bill Watts. So I started seeing Duggan, JYD, Ted DiBiase, Dr. Death. So then all of a sudden I was like, man, I'm getting more into this. And a lot of my friends would make fun of me. They'd say, "Oh, that stuff's fake, blah, blah, blah." But like I said, and some fans out there know what I'm talking about. You were kind of a closet person, if you will, where you had a certain group that would enjoy it, but when you were out with your other friends and stuff, you really didn't talk about it back then. This is quiet. But my friends knew, and that's okay. They still know it today. They still ask about it. But as I got older, I started getting the magazines. I started getting Pro Wrestling Illustrated. That's back in the mid 80s when there was probably 20 different magazines out there.
Oh, yeah.
That you could buy.
Yeah.
Inside Wrestling, Pro Wrestling Illustrated, The Wrestler. I could go on and on. So I started getting those and reading up on it because we still didn't have a lot of, we had some, but we didn't have a lot of the other ones like Portland. I couldn't get Portland. I couldn't get Canada unless it was AWA out of Winnipeg. So I started getting that stuff more, and I was really into it. I really, really loved it. And I can remember one time my parents, I think it was my 18th birthday, my mom, they had a wrestling event in Minnesota at the St. Paul Civic Center. This was in 88. And my mom had called into the local radio station. They were giving away tickets it was the WWF. So it was Hogan, Macho Man, all these guys. She called into the radio station, actually won 4 tickets to the event. Surprisingly, my mom went, my stepdad went. I took my good friend, Jason Russo, and myself. And we actually got a hotel, which surprised me because it's only a couple hours away, but we had a great time. Actually really enjoyed it. Wasn't able to. This is when, McMahon and them were taking over pretty much. And so the wrestlers didn't come out at a time to interact with the fans and stuff. It was, you saw them in the ring, you saw them coming down. They did their thing. They went back to the back. But I really still enjoyed it. I still watched AWA, even though it was going down at that time. I really just, it was I guess it was an outlet for me, because back then, childhood, not to complain, my childhood wasn't terrible by any means, but I just had some issues with family that was an outlet for me. And my grandma was like almost like my savior. She would come in and she knew there was something going on, and she'd always say, "I'm just going to take Brian tonight and take her." She only lived about 20 minutes from our house, so she'd take me, and we go to the wrestling. We go to the video store and rent wrestling videos. Back then, the video rental stores. Some of you
Oh,
probably won't know what those are,
yeah.
but it was a buck or two for a video for overnight, and we'd rent. My grandma let me rent 2 or 3 of them, and we would watch them. She would never, it's grandma. She's gonna let you do pretty much whatever you want as long as it ain't illegal or immoral. They're gonna let you go.
Bless grandma.
And I, yeah, and when I just really, that was just an outlet for me, George, and all you see in the background is many of the classic guys, and that's just because those guys were, I don't want to say heroes, but I looked up to them because they had something, they did something, and it made me feel like, okay, I can accomplish something, so
Yeah.
that's about it in a nutshell. Hey everyone, this is Brian Ferguson, the host of Bumps and Thumps, the talk of wrestling. I want to tell you about a good friend of mine's book, Joyce Poston. Her book, My Ringside Seat to the AWA, gives a close look at all the events she attended in the AWA from the mid-70s through the 80s. Joyce has taken thousands of pictures that you won't see anywhere else and tells stories about her times with Bobby Heenan, Nick Bockwinkel, Sergeant Slaughter, and many others. Also, the foreword of the book is written by Sergeant Slaughter. So go to www.joyceposton.com and get your book today.
Brian, when I listen to you, your story is so similar to, my story.
Yeah.
We've discussed it, but your story is so similar to so many wrestling fans over the decades. When you listen to them, that wrestling was a savior, wrestling was something that they could go to, wrestling was something not everybody understood, but they could get into it and kind of erase the world around them for a little bit. And you talk about your grandma, what a special, I've got a grandma that I've told stories about how just she is one of the prime role models, and your grandma sounds like a saint and somebody special. And that's what I love about wrestling. And I've always wished that the wrestlers themselves would have realized, and I think some did, like a Nick Bockwinkel and some of them, but if they would have realized how important they were to so many young people that needed that outlet. Now, here's the question I have for you. So you've got me going here, and you're telling us about the involvement that you started with. So I'm guessing you said 1988. Well, that makes you about 18 years old at that point in time, if my old bank math is still working. And, like you said, the AWA was obviously suffering some very bad pains, but wrestling was huge all over, like you said. And it was a time when, as a wrestling fan, you could get Georgia, I could get Texas, I'm sure you could, and all these other places. Was there a particular wrestler that you really liked that you would say was your favorite? Did you prefer heels over baby faces? And then the magic question at the end of that, Brian, when did the light bulb go on that you were in the know that wrestling was a work and the endings were predetermined? When did all that come on for you?
Okay, so my favorite wrestler, and you probably already know this, is babyface wise, is Verne Gagne. He was such a class act. He was a very he supported so many things, and when he would get on there on the screen, I mean, he was champion. When I was a kid, he was a champion from 70 to 75, and then he lost to Bockwinkel, and then he got it back in 80, and I was 10 years old or 9 years old when he won it, almost 10, and he held the belt for 2 years. But to me, a guy at that time, especially when I was a little kid, that could come on television, promote, uh, that you're a good person. Anybody can do anything they want, athletically, scholastically. Gagne was like the all-American man, excuse me, that everybody wanted to be. He had the charisma, he had the ability to talk to people, and didn't feel like he was up here, you were down here.
Sure. Exactly.
We were both the same. And I would also say that his son Greg was just starting out in the business then in the early 70s, and he was tag teams champion twice with Brunzell, but
Mhm.
he also pushed Verne. I didn't know this at the time, learned later. Pushed a lot of guys. I didn't know he trained over 144 wrestlers. I had no idea. Verne owned the AWA at the time. I thought it was promoter Wally Carbo and President Stanley Blackburn ran the
That's
show.
what they wanted you to believe, and that's the
Right.
storyline that was out there. Yeah.
Right. So things like that. Now, my favorite heel is, and I'm AWA guy, so it's Nick Bockwinkel. Nick Bockwinkel, you wanted to go through the television screen every week and just tear him up. Even as a little kid, I would always tell my grandma, that guy is so mean. I don't know why they let him on television. He talks so mean about people, but looking back on it now, he was a class act also.
Mm-hmm.
He cheated and he, did all this crazy stuff, but his microphone abilities, his in-ring ability as a heel, especially, bar none, was one of, if not the best as a heel. He put over so many people, as Verne did. But, a lot of guys, and I don't mean to downgrade wrestling today, but a lot of guys today aren't going to put you over as good or as well as those guys did. Yeah. And that's just a era thing. And when, things change, unfortunately, in that aspect, and the light bulb went on when your other question was, when did the light bulb go on? I would say probably in 80, I was probably about 15, 16 years old. My friends would always say, oh, it's fake, it's this and that, it's predetermined, all this and that. Well, I went to one of those matches I was telling you about earlier at the St. Joseph's Catholic School. And I started kind of noticing, when they're in a headlock, they would do this, they'd talk. You couldn't hear them, but you could barely see their lips move a little bit. And then, so I was like, that's kind of strange. What they, and then they would do a move and do a move. Well, by the end of the match, I kind of figured out, okay, they're talking, they're kind of communicating, because you always wondered when you're a little kid, how the heck can they do all this without really hurting somebody? I mean, because some of the moves, even back in the 70s, it wasn't as aerodynamic as it is now, but, whipping into the ropes, clothesline them across their neck. You got to hit a certain point or you could really, hurt somebody. Things like that. You're like, I can't believe somebody ain't going to the hospital. Or, I mean, there were accidents, of course, but I mean, for the most part. So probably about 15, 16, I really kind of realized okay, this is like, they're talking. It's probably already known. But the best thing now, George, back then, is that, and this is from you saying it as well, the booker or the talent, whatever the guy is that determines the matches, just said, this is how I want you to start it, and this is how I want you to end it. Everything in the middle is between you two. You guys call the matches in between. Right. And a match nowadays, longest is probably 15 minutes, maybe.
Yeah.
But I'm being kind of kind. Back then, you could go an hour and wouldn't be bored. it would be like continuously, pretty much nonstop. You'd probably be up off your seat, or at least on the edge of your seat, looking to see what's going on, and like, holy mackerel, because there was a lot more thinking, free thinking, if you will.
Yeah.
And nowadays, yes, it's predetermined. We all know that, if you're watching this, especially, or listening. But it's also very scripted now. And to me, like the other night, I watched the Netflix. I went on there and I watched it. And I don't know if you saw my post. The first hour and a half, or hour and 15 minutes, excuse me, one match.
Yeah. Yeah, I did. And I understand.
One match. You're paying good money to be at that arena to watch wrestling. In total, there were 4 matches, George, in 3 hours. 4. Probably a total of an hour of that 3 hours was wrestling. And I'm being kind there, too. It was probably about 45 minutes. The rest of it was all talking, introducing people from the past. That took 15, 20 minutes. I was very disappointed. And because back in the day, even at these independent shows I go to here, around here, there's 7, 8 matches in a 3-hour period. And there's 1 20-minute intermission. One, and they reset, regroup, and everything. And that's fine. I understand that. You got to reset, regroup, make sure everything's in order. People go get drinks and popcorn or whatever. But when you're on a live television show, especially on Netflix, you should be continuously going. I will say one thing about it. It didn't pixel at all like the Jake Paul, Mike Tyson fiasco fight. That's the only positive thing I can really say out of it. That's my take, is that, and we can go on from there, but I'm passionate about wrestling. And if you're watching, you can see all the things I have, and excuse the background here. I'm on the bed there. We're moving some things, but yeah, I mean, back then it was more about wrestling and not about the reality, the talking and the, that kind of stuff. So.
Well, and Brian, everything you've said, I echo 100%. We do realize, though, that the times have changed. The audience is different. The audience today wants to see what they provided the other night. It could be just 1 or 2 matches, and they are interested more in the talking and the pushing and the shoving and the supposedly surprise entrance with the music popping on. And that's the generation thing. What I love the most is what you said. You named your favorite babyface, as they're called in the business back in the day.
Yeah.
And you named your favorite heel. And, I think, Brian, in that era that you were subjected to, there were probably not any other wrestlers besides Verne and Nick that could define the AWA from a singles wrestler standpoint. From 1970 to about 1983-4, those 2 guys, they were the champs.
Yeah.
And, you had the direct opposite. Verne, I've always called him the mom's apple pie good guy. You described him to a T. He was the guy that you believed in. He was sincere. He was honest. He come across that you on TV, you in the audience could do what he did, work hard. It's good idea to play by the rules. And then the way wrestling was played out, you had that Bockwinkel that was anti everything, sarcastic, snobbish, arrogant, cocky.
Yeah.
And yet you knew he knew as much as Verne, and then they took care of each other when they wrestled. Yeah. And that was the era. So you mentioned Verne Gagne, and I think that's probably, Brian, a good time for us to tie in here. I think it's only logical, as we've talked over the years, that Verne Gagne
Mhm.
have a book. You know, there have been wrestler books like crazy down the pike in the years. You name a wrestler, they've got a book out. And there's wrestling books too, but wrestler books.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
many people have said, where's a Verne Gagne book? When is Verne Gagne going to get a book? I had that question asked me for a decade. And I am very just excited that I can report now to folks here that you, Brian Ferguson, you took the bull by the horns. You said, I am going to do a book on Verne Gagne,
Mhm.
and you did. Look at
There
this,
it is.
fans. Verne Gagne inside and outside the ropes.
There it
What?
is.
Now,
All
Brian,
right. So,
tell me
go ahead.
about it. Tell me about it.
Okay. So, front and back. All right. It's got a lot of little photos on the back. The book is, it took me almost 2 years to write. And I worked with Greg Gagne. I worked some with his two of his three sisters, Kathleen Whistler, and Donna Gagne.
Mhm.
And I worked with you, George. I'm gonna put you over a little bit too because you did help me with it, and I appreciate it. But the book, it's not all wrestling. It is, yes, it has some in it, but this book goes back. It talks about Verne's family lineage first of all in the first few chapters. His family was originally from France, and they immigrated over to Canada in the Winnipeg area, and then worked their way down finally into Corcoran, outside of the Twin Cities, Minnesota. They were farmers. Uh, in fact, Verne's dad, Clarence, was a farmer as well. He did other things, but his primary occupation when he was young was a farmer. Verne lost his mother when he was 12 years old, unfortunately. And then he moved in with his aunt and uncle in Robbinsdale, Minnesota. He was into athletics by then already, and he was already considered one of the best high school or junior high school football and wrestling and baseball players. He actually played baseball. Probably a lot of people don't know that. He played baseball. And he was very good at it. His coach, Red, recommended him to Dr. George Hauser, that time the coach of the Gophers, to go out to Minnesota, University of Minnesota. Verne had no plans to go to Minnesota. He had no plans to go to college. But he decided to. He had already won his high school wrestling championship and was selected as the state left tackle, state level, all state tackle, even though he was a tight end or an end at that time. They're not as tight ends now. Anyways, he went into the University of Minnesota. Did very well there athletically. Academically, not so much. He had to have a lot of help. Considering when later on he's such a business guy and everything, you would figure he would do well in school. I don't think he was really into school. I think he had the ability to do well. He just didn't really apply himself academically. After he graduated high school, of course, he went on to play a little bit of NFL football. He got signed by the Bears, was going to make $5,000 a year, just got married to his wife, Mary, had Greg by 1949, also in the Olympics. I don't want to forget that. Anyway, moving in, he decided to go into pro wrestling. Was trained by Dennis, or not Dennis. George, help me out here.
George Gordienko and Joe
George
Pesci.
Gordienko. Next. Thank you. I got tongue tied there.
Yeah.
Obviously did very well. Did his wrestling career, started out in Texas, Oklahoma area. Goes into that some. Then it goes into the NWA politics, where Verne is in Chicago. He is the hottest thing since sliced bread. He's making as much money. He's making $100,000 a year by 1952. He's only been in the business 3 years.
Folks need to think seriously about that number. when you think about, you had mentioned $5,000 earlier for a
Yeah.
football contract in the
Mhm.
late 40s and
Mhm.
or early 50s, and you come out
Yeah.
with, and that's what they were paid in those days, which would have been a good
Yeah.
salary. But to make
Yeah.
100,000, wow,
Yeah. That's like a
millions,
million probably
millions
today.
today. Yes.
So he started doing that. He hit these roadblocks with the NWA. He was the United. He was a lot of people think Harley Race is the first United States champion. Well, that's not true. Verne Gagne was the first title holder of the United States belt, Chicago version, but Fred Kohler is the one that came up with the idea of the
Mhm.
United States title. So it's actually Verne that held the first United States title. However, there was some disagreements. He actually won the title uh, from Edward Carpentier in 1958. I believe it was 57. I can't remember now off the top of
58,
my head.
August of
Okay,
58.
58. Yeah. Was recognized by a few promoters, but anyways, he ended up losing it later. Henceforth, during that time, he would invest into the Minneapolis territory with Dennis Stecker and Wally Carbo. He invested about $25,000-$30,000 into it, which was big money back then to
Again, huge
invest.
money for the time frame.
Right. Then Dennis decided to sell his portion. Verne bought it. They renamed it the American Wrestling Alliance at that time. Alliance, I want to make sure everybody understands that. And it goes into the story that you have told about the first AWA World Heavyweight Champion, how it was built up. And I will tell you, it is not Pat O'Connor as the first AWA World Heavyweight Champion.
No kidding. Come on.
The story is in the book. You can read about how it was built up. But I want to reiterate, and George has done it many times, Pat O'Connor was not the first AWA World Heavyweight Champion. It was Verne Gagne. And you can read about that in the book. Anyways, it talks about his successes in the 60s, some battles with the first Dr. X, Bill Miller, and then later with Mad Dog Vachon, Crusher, Dr. X, Bill Dyer, and
Dick Beyer.
68. Beyer, excuse me. Sorry,
Dick
Beyer. And Dick Beyer. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm getting tongue-tied here today. Anyways, then it goes into the 70s a little bit. Talks about his trip to Canada with some friends, trip to Wyoming with some friends, and then the inmate belt, how that was created and how the original belt was stolen in Iowa. Inmate belt created, and then his final match in 81, and then his later years, how there's an eminent domain case that is pretty heartbreaking when you're reading it. And his final years and his passing in 2015 at the age of 89. So it's not just wrestling. It has some wrestling in it, but I wanted to do something to honor this man. He did so much. He was the first ever 4-time Big Ten wrestling champion. First ever to do it back in the 40s. And different weight classes, too. It wasn't the same weight class every year. So, and even had a 2-year gap. He served in World War II in the Marine Corps and was a instructor for like combat fighting training. And it's a really good book. And I'm being biased, I know. But, you know, if you go on Amazon, Kobo, Barnes & Noble, Lulu, it's $19.99 for this book, the hard copy, paperback, and it's only $7.99 for the digital.
You know, Brian, one of the things that I think we really want to share to the fans that are interested in the old school like us, and you alluded how wrestling changed. I witnessed that more than anyone, considering that I am, as I said, much, much older than you are. But the thing about when you talk about history of pro wrestling, and if we just go back to, if you want to go to the what was then the modern era after World War II.
Yeah.
Verne Gagne was the epitome of what
Mhm.
professional wrestling was. We all know the gimmickry in wrestling. Everybody has had a gimmick over the years. Gimmicks are what made people attract themselves to wrestling. Verne had a gimmick that he could be real, that he didn't need to wear a clown suit, that he didn't need to come in with a cape, that he didn't need to have a masked identity, that he didn't need to have bleach blonde hair and do strutting. He didn't need to have sequined robes. He didn't need to scream and shout and spit and everything in the camera. Verne Gagne believed, if I give them wrestling, and yeah, we're talking the pro version, we're talking the
Right.
work version. But when you watched, and I have the honor of saying I saw Verne when Verne was a whirlwind in the ring. He was the real deal. When Verne Gagne ran around that ring, gave 3 drop kicks, clamped a sleeper hold on his opponent, it was good night, Irene. The match was over. And, you know, Greg Gagne has told the story. I don't know how much of it is 100% real. I know Greg is telling the truth in the sense that this was a version of what happened to Verne.
Yeah.
When he said that they brought him into the arena and they told him they wanted to put a suit on him and put him in the rafters and have him fly down as a moon man or a spaceman. And Verne said no. And Verne, you know, the story goes that Verne said, line up all the wrestlers in the locker room and I'll take them on one at a time and I'll beat them. And here's the deal. From a legitimate standpoint, we don't have to kid and fudge and lie and create kayfabe here. Verne Gagne, folks, was a real wrestler. And if he wanted to hurt you, if he wanted to twist you and tear you apart in the ring and stretch you, he could. And he would at times teach someone a lesson in the ring that wanted to get cute. You know, I want to see what the guy knows, or I want to see what this guy's all about. And he would get, and Verne would teach him a lesson in the ring. Don't do it. Verne was and Verne Gagne wanted to have wrestling on his marquee and gimmicks second. And you know, the thing about Verne, and I'm glad you brought this up, because Verne was a guy who always wanted to give back. You mentioned about his early childhood. And when folks read about that in the book, you know, he didn't have it easy. And he learned that I can do good without all these moms and dads and positive role models. I can still do good. And God bless his grandma, his parents too, or his foster parents, the aunt and the uncle. You know, they were role models, but Verne wanted to give back. And he did so by not just being cocky and creating his own promotion later on. He spent close to 11, 12, 13 years in this business, working for others and being the best that he was, and being denied championships or top level matches because of jealousy, of politics, etc., behind the scenes. And some of that'll be, you know, talked about too. But Verne gave back. And when he trained wrestlers, he told those guys, I'm going to show you how to fall. I'm going to show you how to fly. I'm going to show you how to show pain. I'm going to show you how to put your opponent over. I'm going to teach you how to talk on an interview. And when you go out there, you'll be good. And the list of 140 some guys, there were some that he worked extremely close with. There were some that he gave a lot of behind the scenes work with, but every one of them, every single one of them, with but the rarest exception, made money and made the business. And Verne gave back that way. And so
he I was just going to say, to me, and when you read this book, I think you're going to realize Verne Gagne was in the 50s, 60s, and even into the early 70s. The Hulk Hogan, the Ric Flair,
Absolutely.
the John Cena. He was them guys before those guys were even born or thought of. He had the credentials, as you said, George, to back everything up that he said or did. He had, I mean, here's a man that was in the Olympics. Yes, he did not compete.
He was an alternate.
He was an alternate. However, how many guys get selected to go to the Olympics for amateur wrestling, either Greco-Roman or freestyle?
Yeah.
Not too many. And to be a 4-time in a row Big Ten, back then Big Nine wrestling champion in different weight classes,
Mm-hmm.
how many people can say that? I'm going to say not too many.
No, you're
Probably
right.
a handful. And so, and Gagne, just to point something out too, George, when I did all this research, there was thousands of articles across the nation on Verne Gagne, from California to New York, at least daily. And I'm not exaggerating here. Daily, there was, during that time, 50 to probably 60, especially, there was something in a sports section of a newspaper in the country about Verne Gagne. Wherever he was competing or wrestling, he was on the marquee. He was in the paper. He was on the radio being talked about, or he was on a television show when television was in its early infancy.
Yeah.
That he honestly, and I'm going to say this, and people might disagree with me, that's fine. He's the one, to me, that created that era of the golden era of wrestling, yes, and also television. He's the guy that made that mindset of television is the key. It was simple, but yet you wanted to watch. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like you had Marty O'Neill out there every week talking to either Verne or whoever, but it was exciting because you wanted to see him. Because sometimes, guess what? When Verne was out there talking, Dr. X might come out there and garble at Verne for a minute, or Larry the Axe Henning, the Pretty Boy Henning then, or whoever.
Yeah.
That was the start of it. That was the start of what now you see all this glitz and glamour and eye candy and fireworks going off. They didn't have that, but that was the start of it. And Verne has never gotten, in my mind, that's what is the reason why I wrote this book, never got the credit really that he has deserved. And I hope you enjoy the read. And I will say this, because I did mess up a couple of names, but I will guarantee you they are right in the book. I just got,
I know they are
a little tongue-tied, so forgive me, but my research is accurate. And George has read it, so he knows. Hey everyone, this is Brian Ferguson. I want to tell you about a great book written by my good friend, Mr. George Schire. It's called Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling, from Verne Gagne to the Road Warriors. George dives deep into the golden age of wrestling, starting with the 1950s, talking about Lou Thez, Verne Gagne, Wilbur Schneider, and many others, and goes all the way deep into the AWA and into the 1980s, ending with the tag team domination of the Road Warriors. Now, this book includes photos of George's personal collection, as well as programs and sports facts that was published for many years. So go to Amazon today or the Minnesota Historical website and get this book as soon as you can. And folks, enjoy the podcast.
You know, the thing is, when we talk about all these things you mentioned about Verne understood the business as the business was in that era. And again, we talk about the new era today, or what it is today. Yeah. Obviously, everything in the world is different. Verne was a guy, and you know, the older we get, Brian, we realize that some things in our lives, we didn't plan to do them. They happen, and we have opportunities that come at us, and we can take them. Yeah. And Verne was one of those guys. He, as you said, college may not have been his thing, but he was good. He was athletically, if it could be done, Verne could do it. And he was a natural, and he wanted to do it. So to have the opportunity to get into football and have the opportunity to get into pro wrestling, and as he worked in pro wrestling, he realized that he could make himself more money by doing the things that he was doing, being a good scientific wrestler, getting television, living in Minnesota, and at the right time, having the television opportunity and the wrestling office buying the company coming his way. In 1959, when Verne and Wally Carbo had their shares, the shares of Dennis Stecker sold to him, they created the alliance, and Verne could be champion. And, you know, the thing about Verne is, yeah, he had a tremendous ego. You know, Verne thought he was the greatest in the world. Verne thought he was perfect. But you know what? In order to succeed in any business, in any CEO hierarchy, if you don't have an ego bigger than the moon, you're not going to be successful. And yes, Verne had that ego. And Verne
did.
And so whatever the critics want to say that, well, Verne put himself over as champion, when you read your book, Brian, you've referred to it a couple of times as this book. I want you to say my book, meaning your book, because you need to be proud that you are opening up this window, this showcase, this life of Verne Gagne, and putting it out there for all these people that have said, where's a Verne Gagne book? And I'm going to tell you, folks, don't borrow it from a friend. Don't hope somebody will tell you what it's about. It's only $19.95, $20. And hey, it's going to be the best $20 you're going to plop down if you're a true wrestling fan, and you're going to be able to hold it, read it, and go, wow, I didn't know this. I didn't know that. And you're going to have a whole new viewpoint of Verne Gagne, this guy you hear about, if you weren't around in his era. And you put all this together, and you've given it to us. I hope you sell 1 million copies. I am prouder than I could ever say of you, Brian. And I'm just thankful that you did what I wasn't going to do anymore. I wasn't going to write a Verne Gagne. I don't want to write anybody's book at this point.
Yeah.
So God love you. You did a lot of research, and don't be afraid to pat yourself on the back for it.
All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
It seriously comes from my heart. I've had a couple people privately ask me, is the book worth it, or is the book okay? And I tell you, God is my witness, I've given them a paragraph or longer and said, buy the book. You're not going to be sorry. There's been so many books that have come down the pike, and I applaud many, many of them. There's been a few clunkers that, you know, I want my money back and the time it took me to read the book. But that isn't the case here. This is a real read. And, you know, you had mentioned that you and I had worked with Greg a couple of times. In doing that, even I learned a couple of things. So this book, you have done so well with it. And this is why I wanted you to have this opportunity to put over, I feel, I will admit, Verne Gagne wasn't my favorite wrestler as a kid growing up. He wasn't the guy that, you know, I got to go see Verne Gagne. But I liked Verne Gagne. I knew wrestling was real when Verne was on the card, and I liked when Verne was in a match, whoever he wrestled. I never saw a bad Verne Gagne match for two reasons. One, Verne knew how to make the other guy look better than he probably was. And if the other guy was really good, Verne could be even better. You know, when you saw Verne wrestle Nick Bockwinkel, they were ring classics because they loved each other and respected each other. And I don't mean love in the sexual term. I'm talking love in the personality. They were friends. When Verne wrestled Billy Robinson, hold for hold, and you know Verne was going to go over. He wasn't going to let Billy get the decision. But Billy and Verne, magic. Verne and Lou Thez wrestling. There were only about 7 of them. I've got them listed. Matches between those two champions.
Right.
But 7 classics. And if you can find
Yeah.
one on YouTube, grab a Kool-Aid or a cup of coffee or a beer and watch it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
folks, I wanted to take this chance today I told Brian I'm taking over the show today, and I wanted to have him as a guest. And I've really enjoyed what you shared, and I am proud of you. And I want this book to be the main event that it is, about a main event guy that has
Yeah.
been researched by a main event friend and researcher.
Oh, thank you.
So give yourself
I
credit.
appreciate it. Thank
And-
you. And I want to say that, I did take a lot of time, and this is the first book I've ever done in my entire life. The only thing I've done before that was I wrote some college papers, and I was in the military for 26 years, and I wrote a lot of military orders, which is a lot different than this. But the research part was the best part. You learn so much stuff, and you don't appreciate, like when I was a kid, I appreciate Verne and Nick and a lot of wrestlers from that area a lot more today than I did when I was, a preteen or a teenager. Because when you look back, really, George, you look back at that, those guys from the 50s into the 80s were really the pioneers and the foundation of what they have today. Now, grant you, it's a lot of more talking and stuff, but those guys back then laid that foundation, worked their way up, and Verne was truly one of the true pioneers. He had a vision, and it worked. It worked for 30 years, 31 years. Yes, in the late 80s, it was starting to go down, and he didn't want to change some things, but that's because older you get, you will get more set in your ways. I mean, I'm a prime example of that as well. I don't like a lot of change either, but sometimes you got to, especially when you're in a business. And unfortunately, Verne thought it was just a fad. It was going to go away. Unfortunately, it didn't. And there's a lot of things in there. I just want to point out one other thing. There was no such thing as contracts back in the 70s and early 80s. It was a handshake. You made a deal. You did your commitments, and you got paid. And there's two things. You're right. Verne had a high ego, and some people didn't care for his way of doing business. But two things people always said, and I reiterate this: you got time off, and you got paid well. Those two things, because I'm telling you, especially in today's business, those guys are working 300. Now they're getting paid very well, millions of dollars, most of them. But you're working 300 plus days a year, and you don't have a family life. And Verne was big on family. I will say that, and that's in the book. He loved his family. He loved being around his family. He was a very family-oriented man, and he expected his wrestlers to take care of their families. And if they needed time, something happened, the storyline had to change for whatever reason, they did it.
Yeah.
And they did it on the fly. It wasn't like 6 weeks out unless they were, moving on. I can't do this anymore. I'm leaving tonight. It wasn't like that back then. And
Right.
I mean, there was probably a few exceptions, but for the most part, and guys like you and I, we're kind of I'm hoping it's coming back. I see a lot of more people at, especially the indie shows, and indie shows nowadays are a lot better than they were 10 years ago.
Yes,
10,
absolutely.
15 years ago.
Absolutely.
They're not the clown shows or carnival BS acts that you saw back then. They are a lot more legitimate because they want to move up. They want to get more money. They want to work. They work hard. And if you can go out to a show, go to a show. I think you'll really enjoy it. I really do. They're only like $10, $15, or $20, $25 for a ticket. Where if you go to the WWE, AEW, you're going to pay at least $70, if not more, for just the ticket, your ticket.
Yeah.
So go out and I will say, get the book, read it, ebook or hard copy, and write a review. If you like it, great. I'd love to hear about it. If you don't like it, tell me what I could have done better. I'll take it. I got thick skin. You know, I was in the Army for quite a few years. I got a little thick skin. I don't got a lot of hair on top anymore, but
Well,
I'm
I'm only gonna say this to you. For anybody out there that wants to be a critic or wants to find fault in it, I'm going to say this. There's no book, mine included, any book that has been published on wrestling over the last 2 decades. There is no book that's absolutely perfect. No book that on wrestling now we're talking. There's no book that's been absolutely the book for every single wrestling fan. There's no book out there that's ever given every single reader exactly everything they wanted in the book. But one thing I know, and you can relate to this now, Brian, I remember the words that were given to me. Well, why don't you write a book? Because I would complain about somebody else's, or I'd have this criticism or something. And you know as well as I do now that it's very easy to say, well, why don't you do a book? But it's a labor of love. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of frustration. It's a lot of disappointments. It's a lot of doing over. It's a lot of rewriting. It's a lot of work, bottom line. And in the end, when you finally have that finished product, which we now have, it is something that you can sit back, and this is why I want you to feel this. Be proud. You've given them the book on Verne Gagne, and folks, seriously, I don't endorse everything. This one is a good one. This one is the champion book about the champion wrestler. And Brian did it. Brian's given it to you. Run, as Marty O'Neill used to say, run, don't walk, to get your copy. And with that, Brian, I just want to say thank you for today. I think it's been fun. Thanks for being my guest on Bumps and Thumps.
It was my pleasure, and thank you for taking over as the host. I couldn't have asked for anybody better. And I want to say one more thing, if I could. I want to thank my wife, Sheila. She had to endure this for the last 2 years. Never complained, always supported me, even up our drives up to Minnesota, Wisconsin to do those interviews, to meet with you. You've met my wife. I've met your wife. And she has just been a saint in this. And she's always supported my wrestling accolades, if you will. And she's not the fan like I am or you are, but she supports it, and I just want to do a shout out to her and what she does for our family, and thank her for her support in this, because without her, it would have been probably impossible to do it. So I want to thank her.
When we get off, you give her a hug. Tell her I agree with everything you said.
I will.
Okay.
I appreciate it. All right.
Hey,
so
folks, thanks for Bumps and Thumps, and Brian, sell a million.
Thank you, sir. And we'll talk to you guys soon.